Greetings fanboys and fangirls, Jared here with another video review from Fanboys Forever. And it's been far too long since I've gotten to review a Masters of the Universe figure, particularly a new Eternia Masters of the Universe figure from the Masterverse line. Of course, Masterverse is Mattel's kind of replacement for Masters of the Universe Classics. It is in that 7-inch scale and is found at mass retail. I picked this guy up from Entertainment Earth, a kind of unusual thing for me as I usually go through Big Bad, but they got these guys in first. What we're looking at today is the brand new Eternia Flying Fists He-Man. Flying Fists was a variant back in the day from the original Masters of the Universe line. Basically, the Flying Fists He-Man was a way for He-Man to take this kind of large launcher type of thing that had kind of a bola on the end of it, and it would spin as you rotated them back and forth. This has been reinterpreted in a very interesting new way here for the new Eternia line, and marks one of the biggest departures from the classic version that we've ever seen from a new Eternia He-Man. Also, be comparing them to many of the other various Flying Fist versions to let you know which one I believe is the best. With all that out of the way, let's begin. First, we'll just have a quick look at the box here. I have to say I really do enjoy the artwork that they've come up with, but then again, when do I not? I really like the new Eternia Too Bad representation on there. I also really like the kind of pink look at the Sorceress pack there. That's interesting. But I think that what's really cool is that we see the main lion tower representation from the Eternia playset. And that is also worked into He-Man's powers, as we will soon see on the armor. Not only that, but they do have a very brief description of this He-Man and his story. He-Man discovers an ancient weapon fueled by the power of Grayskull, long thought lost, which shows him the way of the Flying Fists. He's the heroic leader with arm-swinging action. And this guy doesn't have arm-swinging action, so I thought I would be clear on that. Anyway, though, we do have a cross-sell at the bottom, more artwork on the side, and of course a UPC code if you're on the lookout for this guy. With all that out of the way, let's begin. So just so that we're clear, New Eternia is kind of a reinterpretation line so that Mattel can kind of rejuvenate old concepts from different parts of the Masters of the Universe mythos and kind of inject them with some new ideas. A lot of the time this takes the form of some alternative looks and variant armor pieces that can be clipped on over more of a standard classic version. And new Eternia Flying Fists He-Man here is no exception to that rule. So let's go ahead and just talk about some of the sculptural things. First of all, we do have that brand new He-Man head sculpt that was first introduced in the Thunder Punch figure that we had a couple of waves back. I'm a pretty big defender of this particular head sculpt. I actually think it looks really good. In particular, I think that this is a step in the right direction. I think a lot of the things that people kind of have an issue with this particular head sculpt has to do with paint application that they've seen in prototype photos where it does look quite bizarre. I think they've actually done a good thing by stepping back some of the paint, and we'll get into that a little bit more later when we compare him to the old Thunder Punch variation of this same head sculpt. I think they've done a really good job on the kind of dirty blonde look of the hair, which is something that I feel is essential from the old original He-Man figure. We should definitely talk about the first of a few major deviations from that original design. If you have a look, he has these new kind of shoulder pads right here. And they're very clearly modeled for, well, exactly what's in the background, which is the Central Tower Lion. Now, I have actually went back through and kind of reviewed some Masters mythology and looked up some stuff on the Battle Ram blog, which is always my favorite source for double-checking some of my Masters knowledge. And I have not been able to find any kind of tie between the Flying Fist powers and the Central Tower of the Massive Eternia playset. So I don't really know what the reasoning was here. It's certainly an interesting idea, though. Down here, you can even see that come back again right there. There's the lion from Central Tower. I don't think it's supposed to be Battle Cat. Certainly the lines and all of that on the face look exactly like the pattern we see on the Central Tower. Not only that, but the artwork from the packaging pretty well confirms that that's the intention, as they very prominently include the lion head. So yes, here we do have kind of a switch up in the mythology that at least in the land of New Eternia, these Flying Fist powers are very much based upon Central Tower, or at least the lion head on the Central Tower. Another switch up is that he doesn't have any kind of metallic silver right here. I think that they tried to do their kind of plastic mix thing that is supposed to make it look a little more metallic, but I don't really think it turned out that way. It's just maybe one shade away from just being standard old gray. It's certainly not very metallic-y there. Another big change they've made is they have this new loincloth piece over the furry underwear. Now, as for the logo here, or the symbol, I'm not really sure. Maybe one of you all can tell me what this means or what it is exactly. In a way, I would almost think that it's two Fs that stands for flying fists. And now, of course, I know that it's probably, meant to be some kind of mystical symbol, but it does look like two Fs that are back to back. So that's just my theory on what it's supposed to be, like as if it's standing for flying fists and the H, He-Man. So I guess that might be where they're going, but you tell me in the comments if that's what you think. Another variation is they have given him armored boots, which is not something that we've ever seen before with this variation of He-Man, or any He-Man for that reason, in the original vintage line. Other than that, things that are pretty much kept the same is the shield, and certainly the bola here is certainly pretty similar to the original. We have a little holder for the bola. Beyond that, there really isn't a whole lot that's been left untouched by this new design. Certainly the H is pretty similar, I guess, to the standardized old 80s He-Man H, but that's it. All right, let's briefly go over a couple of little errors that were on mine that I've had to at least partially correct. One of them is that there's been a very untidy job done on spraying the red on this H logo. You can see it doesn't quite meet to the top, and there's a little bit of overspray down here, which I need to remove. And I did have to dab just a little bit of a paint marker there because we had a little bit of it chipped off. So the red was kind of sloppy here, and I still need to do some things to kind of tighten it up. So that's a real shame. Also, since the case does have two of these guys in it, I noticed that the other one didn't quite have enough gold to get this outer edge. And this one also had a little chip in the red here. You can see where it's the texture is a little rough, where I had to take that paint marker to cover it up. So some really sloppy production on this guy in terms of the paint application, which was something that was really disappointing to me. One thing I can say is that it does appear that the eye applications are done very well. It's not perfect, as Mattel does seem is struggling to get their tampographic details or printing, whatever you want to say, exactly aligned to their very small areas that they have available on the eye sculpts. But, with mass production, nothing like that's ever going to be completely perfect. So I will show you a couple of his action features. One of them is that just like the original, you can take the shield and you can spin it around right here on the top. It's kind of a shame that these bolts here aren't painted silver. I think that would do a little bit to kind of vary it up. One thing I did want to highlight is how much I like the design of the actual gun itself, where it looks like there's some kind of tracks going on in here and all sorts of little techie details in the spear at the end. I think that looks really cool. I do like the weight of spinning these guys around, even if it kind of bangs into this a little sometimes. It's still a lot of fun. This is also a good time to mention that I really like their gold plastic that they used. It's certainly a lot more eye-catching than the silver that they used. This is paint here, as is this. But again, some nice gold plastic up there as well for the shoulder pads, and usually companies have a really hard time with this. One area where the gold plastic isn't as convincing is these spheres on the weapon, because they have that kind of murky look where you have all the little lines in it, so it looks more marbly than gold. Another spot, the gold paint looks really good down here as well, and for some reason, the silver on the boots looks markedly better than the silver on the chest piece, so that's a little strange. This back here is removable, where you can store the gun, and you can just take it out like that. Why you would want to do that, I have no idea, because it looks awful without it, with the two big gaping holes. This whole chest armor assembly is completely removable, but there's not much use in doing it because it's the same He-Man chest that we've been seeing that they've redone recently. That's the more bulked up look. Now, this does not feature any of the original's action feature, so if you want to simulate that, you will certainly just put the arms up like this, and you would just try to, bring them around like that, but it doesn't really work. The articulation, I guess you could make the waist turn, but even swinging it around, the bola thing is not really doing what it's supposed to do. So this is not the kind of thing to where you're actually going to use it to get the original play feature. This is just made to look like it could do the original play feature. And I can certainly understand why that might be disappointing for some folks, but for me, action features are definitely not why I would be buying a Masterverse figure, although they can sometimes be a nice cherry on top. So this is definitely a good moment, I think, to talk a little bit about this head sculpt, which has definitely been a lightning rod for controversy and has definitely landed me in hot water with a few commenters in the past. I will continue defending this head sculpt, and maybe even more now. I think this is as close as Mattel has ever gotten to doing kind of a revamped head sculpt, aside from maybe what the Horsemen were able to do with that extra Savage He-Man head sculpt that was made to look like the original toy. Now, I'll show you what it looks like in comparison to what they did on their last Thunder Punch figure. And they've done a couple of things to tighten it up, I believe, in the time since. Certainly, one thing they've done is they have kept the eyes from looking just so white and light blue, and they've given him a little bit more of a pupil over here, so he looks a little more lively. Another thing is, for good or ill, they have decreased the amount of paint application and highlighting on the cheekbones. Over here, they have a little bit of application to where it kind of highlights all sorts of things in the face and the lips and the eyebrows and things, and even shadow under the hair, which I thought was really cool. Over here, they have opted not to do it, and it does result in kind of, I guess, a more standard looking He-Man head. So I think that a lot of people will find this one a lot more pleasing. The hair is ever so slightly darker over here too. I'm not really sure what that's down to. I think it might be slightly too dark here. I think this was the right shade, but honestly, I think this is just down to preference. Like I said, there's less paint budget going on over here, so you might look at it and say, well, they cheaped out. But this one maybe is a little too highlighted, and I think that threw some people off. Truly, this really is a matter of preference. So one thing that I will also show you is that you do have one kind of option that you can use to actually plus this guy up a little, and that's these bracers that he's wearing here. These are certainly interesting, and they're not like anything that we saw on the original, and this is kind of its own visual thing. But what you can do to make it even more its own thing is it comes with a set of fisted hands that are like kind of robotic gloves. And once you switch that out, it's actually a pretty cool look. I think that it works well, especially since this is Flying Fists He-Man. I guess that it does go a ways in at least giving a slight explanation for maybe why He-Man's fists themselves would be powered up in this form. I always did think it was kind of funny on the original toy that he's got this big shield and this big like weapon swinging around, and there isn't much of his own fists doing anything. And here I think the designers thought, well, let's give the fists themselves a little bit of a power up, and I think it works pretty well. I'll go ahead and take the shield off over here so that you can see the other one. And there he is. Once again, you can see that the fists look really cool here, and I actually think this is a really nice look. So it's certainly different than the original, but it does succeed in giving this guy a little bit more of his own identity. The one thing that I will be critical about with these fists is that they're fists. So you can see that there's no way to put an accessory in, meaning that you can't actually put this part into the actual hand. So instead, you do have the option of just taking this and putting it over the arm, and then kind of missing it to the side a little bit, and it still works. So at least you can do that, but it is kind of aggravating that this is just sitting there, and you would almost think that it needs to be in the fist. But it still looks pretty good this way, I think. I wish they had included just one more set of these so that we also could have had that little bit of extra functionality. And the same in a way is true about the shield, because the smaller strap can't go into an open hand. Instead, much like the weapon, you can just kind of put the larger part on, and it works just fine that way. So it's definitely a little easier to cheat with the shield. Something else you can do is take his weapon, and you can certainly clip that right onto the back right there. And it makes for a kind of a neat display, as you can see the spheres back there. And I think that that's a pretty cool look for this Flying Fist He-Man. And I certainly won't bore you all with any kind of articulation explanation because you've heard it a million times at this point. Just know that he does feature the drop-down hips that we really like to see in these new releases, and the only place where he's sort of limited is in putting his arms all the way up here because of the shoulder pads. Of course, if you remove those aren't a problem. However, they do flex quite a ways to where you can bring the arm up pretty far. The chest armor does kind of lock out a lot of the ab crunch articulation. Down here at the boots, it does limit the hinge just a little bit because of the sculpting. As you can see, it can only go that far. And we're usually accustomed to it going a little further forward. Other than that, it's exactly the same as what we usually see with these figures. So let's talk about the ability to actually convert this to a more classic look, which is usually something that they've really given us a whole lot of leeway to be able to do. So I will show you that with the shoulder pads, which are probably the biggest deviation from the original, you can just pull these out, as you probably already anticipated, as we've seen many times before. But these are definitely more stuck in. They're so stuck in that I actually suggest heating them up a little bit beforehand. I didn't, but I was in a hurry. And this is what you have left. And so you can still see that we have those raised portions where it originally stuck in, where the shoulder pads used to go. And of course, we can take these hands off, and these gauntlets are removable pieces. The trouble, though, is if you only have this figure and this figure alone, you'll plug the hands in, and this is what you would be left with. Certainly something's missing, and that's He-Man's power bracelet things. So what do? Well, if you actually have the Thunder Punch He-Man from a couple of waves back, he has removable red bracelets. And of course, on the original Flying Fist He-Man, he does have the red ones. And since it's the same sculpt, these fit exactly the same way. And this is about as classic as you can get him to look. And even then, you have to use parts from another figure that isn't this one. If you're a purist for the original, you're going to see that the boots don't match. You're also going to see that there's these big raised portions up here, which don't look that bad. When he's turned to the side, it looks a little weird because obviously something's missing. But definitely, it's serviceable, I think, as a representation of that original look. I think one of the biggest reasons it doesn't quite work is because there's this loincloth piece, which I knew from the initial images was just going to be there to stay. So I think that does kind of get in the way of being able to really have a convincing original version of this guy. And once you add those two things, it certainly gives you a little bit better look at kind of getting towards that original. However, this really isn't an advertised feature, and it's really something you would have to use another figure to do. So I feel that it's better to judge this guy on his merits as the new version and not trying to kind of finagle together something that it's not really meant to do. Although it's still a cool option if you're like me and you're a completist for the line. And just to get him back into that mode, you can see that we can push those back through. It's a little easier to put these back on than it was to take them off. All right, so I feel this would be a good time to compare him with some of the other versions that we've seen of this guy in the modern era. One that I definitely feel we should look at is one of my personal favorites from the line, and that was the Origins version. You know, unfortunately, this guy doesn't really stand up very well to this one, in my opinion, at least from a visual standpoint. You have the awesome kind of vac metallization, which is really a great mastering of that process that Mattel certainly has done. And especially, you know, the action feature working so well. I don't have his weapon with him, but you can kind of get the idea from the shield here. This guy is a whole lot more dynamic looking than this one. However, I still do like the kind of extra beats that he has in terms of some of the armor. So it's not a total wash or anything like that. Definitely another one that I think people will be curious to see is the Mattel Masters of the Universe Classics version here. It's kind of weird for me because in my head I have these guys as being somehow larger, but they're actually significantly smaller than a whole lot of these Masterverse figures that we have these days. So by a good half inch a lot of the time. Certainly this figure was coming out around the time where I feel like Mattel didn't really care that much, that they were just trying to get these guys out to appease the fans, you know, so that people wouldn't complain, so they could say that they had the complete line. I think that resulted in this guy having like too dark of a skin tone. The head sculpt was in desperate need of updating at this point, and because he was a little too tan, it caused the blonde to kind of look off as well. He is kind of metallic, at least more metallic than this guy is, but it ends up somehow looking flat. I don't really know how else to describe it. I was always a little bored by this guy, especially because the armor kind of did the thing that a lot of classics figures did, to where it bulks him out way too much and it throws off all the rest of his proportions. So I do think this guy is pretty easily better than the classics version, but not the Origins. Here's at least the armor from the Battle Armor version from Masters Universe Revolution. I used my extra He-Man movie head, which I kind of squished down a little bit to look a little better. And I just brought this out for the purpose of showing you that the armor was definitely possible to have a more paint effect on it that it should have had. And this looked really good with that kind of paint effect of the silver. Shame that they couldn't do the same over here and went with plastic instead. And then I think this would be a lot of people, myself included, our kind of preferred He-Man right here at the moment. I do get questions sometimes if my hot water trick that I did a video about is still held up, and yes, I've never had to repeat it for this guy, and so his chin is still perfectly shaped. But yeah, this figure from Masters Universe Revolution is still pretty incredible side by side, and probably won't be dethroned anytime soon. And just because here is another new Eternia He-Man, this was the first new Eternia version that they did, and I have him in his original Barbarian getup right there. And I think they look pretty cool together. And as we mentioned earlier, the quite controversial Thunder Punch He-Man from this line. You know, it was always going to be interesting for me to have these guys side by side, because I know that there's going to be things that different people like about both, and it's going to be kind of tough to determine which one is best. For me, even if the paint application is a little overbearing and not quite right, I'm still preferring this Thunder Punch He-Man right over here. It just seems to visually come together a little bit better. There's certainly more stuff going on over here with this Flying Fists He-Man in terms of all the armor and the shoulder pads and everything, but I think that this guy's visual comes together a whole lot better, and I love that paint highlighting that some people maybe are a little freaked out by. One thing I did want to show you is, unfortunately, if you were a little put off by that last head sculpt, I'm not really sure that this new one works on the Thunder Punch body. To me, it's just really the wrong color. It's certainly the wrong shade. I understand why they did this, though, to kind of, you know, vary it up so it's not just the same figure over and over again, but you can see that it's going to be a tough sell on that particular body in terms of paint. You know, I really do think that this is a pretty noble try in terms of doing an update of that Flying Fist design. I've always thought that the Flying Fist design does suffer from being just a little bland sometimes and didn't have as much of an identity of its own. I can tell that the designers at Mattel felt much the same way, and they did everything they could to try to make this guy a little more interesting. I do feel like tying it to the lion of the central tower is a really good move, and I think it works really well. So easily my favorite part of this design is the integration of the central tower lion head on the shoulders and at the bottom of the armor. I also think that the loincloth, even if it's a little unnecessary, actually looks pretty good too. They've pretty much done whatever they could to try to make this guy a little more interesting, and I appreciate that. I think where it does fall a little bit for me is in terms of execution. Mattel, for whatever reason, I feel just didn't have the same level of execution here that they did on, say, the Thunder Punch He-Man. It certainly works really well, but all these little paint blemishes and problems that this guy had were a little aggravating. I do think most of the applications were fine, but it is always frustrating to have to fix a few little nicks and things on your figure. Other than that, I do think that he turned out really well. I think for the $22.99 or so that he retails for, that he's a good bargain because he comes with a lot of great alternative pieces. I would have loved an alternative head of some sort, maybe one that's yelling like the Origins figure had, but I think in the end what this guy really needed was a little bit more of a bright silvery paint job on that chest armor. I think without it he ends up looking a little drab because that just looks more like gray and not that bright shiny silver that we should have had with the vac metallization or the metallic effect on it. This is especially disappointing because there wasn't any articulation here on the chest armor that would have caused that to have been a problem. Usually the reason they won't do that is for rubbing on articulation. Well, this would have been a good opportunity to have done such, but I imagine it just didn't cost out. Other than that, I feel like that fans would really enjoy this figure, and I certainly think it is a cool update to that original Flying Fists look. It's just that I don't think it's going to be dethroning any of the best figures of the line anytime soon. Alright, and with all that out of the way, I really do appreciate you guys watching today. Keep in mind, I will be reviewing the rest of this new wave, including going back and hitting some of the old wave that I pretty much skipped over. Turns out when you have an infant, it's a little bit harder to film these things. I really do appreciate you watching, since I'm not able to get out quite as much as I used to, since of course my wife and I have had our first child. So I really do appreciate your support though, and of course encourage you to comment down below, and if you haven't yet, to please subscribe. Both of these things really go a long way in encouraging me to make more content, and also helps it to be shared out across YouTube. And if you really do appreciate the work I do here, there's always the thanks button. And of course, let me know what you think down below in the comments about this guy. Do you feel like it's a step too far and they kind of gotten too far away from that original concept? Do you like the new additions? How do you feel about this latest attempt at that head sculpt that was so controversial with the Thunder Punch figure? And where do you feel this guy ranks between the Origins and the Classics? Alright friends, with all that out of the way, God bless you and yours, and I'll see you on Fanboys Forever. Fanboy out.